Welcome to Revolution Chronicles, where we bring America's forgotten past back to life. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a journey into history. Now let's step back in time and through unseen photographs. Uncover the powerful stories that will change the way you see the past. Asterisk the year was 1857, and Arkansas was still young, raw, and rough. Little Rock stood on the banks of the Arkansas River, a place of dusty roads, creaking wagons, and sprawling farms that stretched beyond the eye. The city was only a few decades old, but it already carried the weight of America's contradictions. It was a land of promise for some and a land of chains for others. Thanksgiving was not yet the polished holiday of parades and feasts that it would later become. In those years, it was simpler: families gathering, food laid out on heavy wooden tables, prayers rising in quiet rooms. But for those enslaved, Thanksgiving was no day of thanks. It was just another day to serve, another day of hunger, another day of being reminded of what they would never have done on the outskirts of Little Rock. A plantation sat heavy in the late autumn air. It belonged to a man named William Hardy. He was not the richest planter in Arkansas, nor the poorest. He was middle standing, with a farm large enough to hold dozens of enslaved men and women, enough to make him a man of pride. Hardy was known in the community as stern, quick to anger, and fiercely protective of his property. To the enslaved people who lived under him, he was something else entirely. He was a man who believed cruelty was strength. His punishments were meant to break both body and spirit. He believed in making an example out of men so that women would fear, and making an example out of women so that children would tremble. That was his way. Among the people forced to live under Hardy's rule was a man named Samson. Samson was a towering figure, even among men. Broad shoulders, thick arms, and a chest that looked carved from stone. Some whispered that no man in Pulaski County could match his strength. But strength, for Samson, was both a blessing and a curse. The same muscles that gave him power in the fields made him a target in the eyes of his master. Hardy saw in Samson not a man but a tool, a beast of burden that could pull more weight, cut more wood, and pick more cotton than anyone else. Samson had been driven since boyhood to the edge of his strength. Whipped when he slowed, starved when he resisted, and yet he endured, carrying within him a silent fire that never died. The autumn of 1857 was a hard season on the plantation. Crops had not yielded as expected, and Hardy's temper grew blacker by the day. His frustration spilled onto the backs of those he owned. Men were whipped harder, women forced to labor longer, children sent into fields when their bodies should have been at play. Samson carried logs so heavy that other men could not even lift them. But it was not the labor that hardened his heart. It was the way Hardy looked at him, as if Samson were nothing more than an ox. No name, no soul, just muscle and obedience. Thanksgiving drew near, and Hardy decided to host a gathering. Neighbors, friends, and fellow landowners were to come. Food would be laid across long tables, and servants would stand at the ready to serve. For Hardy, it was not about gratitude but about pride. He wanted to show others that even in a lean year, he could still put on a display. He wanted to show them his power. And on that day, Samson would be forced to serve, standing tall and silent in the room, eyes lowered, hands ready. But inside Samson, something stirred. He had endured years of lashes, years of humiliation, years of nights lying awake in the cold, hearing the cries of women pulled from their beds and the moans of men beaten until their flesh split. He had carried pain upon pain, but never broken. Now, as the holiday approached, a new thought began to take root. It was not just resentment. It was something sharper, something dangerous. It was the thought that maybe a man could only be bent so far before he snapped. The night before Thanksgiving, the air was thick with smoke from fires where enslaved women cooked food that they would never taste. The smell of roasted turkey, cornbread, sweet potatoes, and pies filled the kitchen, though none of it was meant for them. Samson stood outside, splitting wood under the watchful eye of an overseer. The axe rose and fell, each strike echoing into the dark. Sweat rolled down his back though the air was cool. His mind was not on the wood. It was on Hardy. Every memory of being struck, every insult, every lash burned hotter in his chest. Morning came, and the house filled with guests. Wagons rolled up, boots clattered on the porch, laughter and voices carried through the air. Inside, Hardy played, the generous host, his wife at his side, his children darting through the rooms. Servants carried trays, poured drinks, and fetched more wood for the fire. Samson was ordered to stand near Hardy, ready to obey at a moment's call. He stood tall, his shadow stretching long across the room. People glanced at him, some with fear, some with awe. His size alone seemed to unsettle them, yet they said nothing. For he was only a slave, and his body belonged to Hardy. The meal stretched long, voices rising louder with drink, songs sung, and laughter spilling across the table. Hardy drank deeply, boasting of his strength, of his farm, of his ability to keep men in line. He even clapped Samson on the shoulder once, as if he were some prized horse, showing him off to his friends. This one, Hardy said with a laugh, could tear a man in two if I let him. Strong as an ox, but tame. Ain't that right, boy? Samson did not answer. He lowered his eyes. But inside, something flared. The night grew late, and guests began to leave. The plantation house quieted, though voices still carried in the parlor where Hardy remained, drunk and prideful. He called Samson to bring more wood for the fire. Samson obeyed, carrying in logs as though they weighed nothing. Hardy smirked, boasting again of the man's strength. Then, in a moment that no one could have foreseen, everything changed. Hardy staggered towards Samson, clapping him hard on the chest, mocking him before the few guests who still lingered. He called him a brute, a beast, something less than a man. And then he shoved him. That was the spark. Samson had endured years of torment, years of being treated like nothing, but this moment, the laughter, the shove, the insult, snapped something inside him. His great hands, so used to lifting wood and bending iron, closed around Hardy's shoulders. In one swift motion, faster than anyone could react, Samson's hand shot to Hardy's neck. There was a sound, a sharp, terrible crack, that silenced the room. Hardy's body went limp. His head lolled unnaturally. The laughter died, the glasses froze midair. A hush fell heavy, like the breath of death itself. Samson stood still, Hardy's lifeless body hanging in his grip. His chest heaved, his eyes burned, his muscles trembled not from fear, but from the flood of release. For a moment, time held its breath. Then the screaming began. There is something about looking into a photograph that time has almost forgotten. The people there, they never posed for us. They never thought that someday their faces would be studied by strangers in the future. And that is what makes these unseen photographs so powerful. They are honest. They show us life as it was, without polish, without performance. They are raw, and they remind us of truths that words sometimes soften. Consider a photograph taken in 1908. It shows a family traveling westward in a wagon pulled not by horses, but by oxen. Their belongings are piled high. Chairs, quilts, pots, and pans, everything they own strapped down for the long journey. The father sits high on the wagon bench, gripping the reins, his face thin and weathered from years of work. The mother holds an infant wrapped in a faded blanket. Behind them, two older children cling to the side of the wagon, their eyes wide, with both fear and wonder. The westward journey had always been romanticized in stories and songs, but photographs like this remind us of its harshness. The dirt roads, the endless miles, the risk of sickness, storms, and hunger. These families were not adventurers in the way we often picture them. They were desperate. They were seeking something better than what they had left behind. That single photo tells us about the courage it took to uproot your life, to leave the familiar and set your face toward a horizon that promised nothing. It is easy for us now to speak of pioneers as symbols of bravery, but when you stare at that image, you see the tired eyes of a man who had no choice, the determined jaw of a woman who would not let her children go hungry, and the innocent faces of children who trusted without fully understanding the hardship to come. Another photograph, a few decades later, shows a very different kind of movement across America. It is 1936, Oklahoma. A battered truck rolls down a road lined with dry fields. The truck is so overloaded with belongings that you wonder how it even moves. On top, strapped down with ropes, are mattresses, bed frames, and broken furniture. Inside, you see a family crammed together, the father gripping the steering wheel, the mother leaning against the door, and 4 children squeezed into the back. Their eyes are hollow. This was the migration of Dust Bowl families, fleeing the land that had betrayed them, heading west in search of California's promise. When you look at this photograph, you cannot escape the feeling of loss. These were people forced to leave behind not only their homes, but their identities. Farmers who had once owned land now reduced to wanderers. Families who had once stood on their own feet now forced to beg for work in fields far from home. The photo is more than an image. It is an entire story frozen in time. It whispers to us of broken dreams and stubborn hope. And it makes us wonder, what became of them? Did they find what they were searching for? Did they survive, thrive, or vanish into the endless line of forgotten names? Unseen photographs are powerful because they reveal what history books too often overlook. The textbooks may tell us about the economic crash, the wars, the inventions. But these images show us the texture of life, the wrinkles of worry, the moments of joy, the little details that make up human existence. For example, there is a photograph from 1915 of a barbershop in a small town in Illinois. Inside, men in suspenders sit lined up in chairs, their hats resting on their knees. The barber, his mustache carefully waxed, leans close with a straight razor in hand. In the mirror, you catch a glimpse of a boy standing just outside the door, peeking in. He cannot afford a haircut, but he watches as though witnessing a ritual. That photo tells us so much about community. The barbershop was more than a place for grooming. It was a gathering spot where men discussed politics, weather, and local gossip. The boy outside represents the longing of youth, watching the world of adults, eager to be a part of it. It is not a grand photo, not a scene of national importance, but it is history nonetheless. It tells us about the fabric of daily life in small-town America, the quiet rhythms that shape generations. There is another photograph that tugs at the heart, taken in 1947, after the war had ended. It shows a soldier returning home. He stands on the porch of a modest white house, his uniform pressed but wrinkled from travel. His wife clings to him, her face buried in his chest, while his young son stares up at him with wide, searching eyes. The boy looks as though he is trying to remember, trying to match the man before him with the faint memory of the father who left years earlier. You can feel the mixture of joy and strangeness in that photo. The war was over, the soldier was home. But nothing was the same. The boy had grown, the wife had endured, and the man who returned was not the same man who had left. That photograph tells a story of reunion, yes, but also of the quiet struggles of adjustment, of finding a way back to ordinary life after years of extraordinary hardship. It is a reminder that war does not end when the guns fall silent. It lingers in the hearts of those who lived through it, in the families who waited, in the children who grew up with the shadow of absence. Another powerful image shows a factory floor in Detroit during the height of World War II. Rows of women stand before machines, their hair tied back with scarves, their hands steady and precise as they build parts for bombers and tanks. Their faces are determined, their shoulders squared. They were the women of Rosie the Riveter fame, though most never wore the iconic polka dot bandana or appeared on posters. They were ordinary women, housewives and daughters, who stepped into roles once reserved for men and proved themselves more than capable. That photograph glows with pride. You can almost hear the roar of machinery, smell the grease and sweat, feel the pulse of urgency that beat through the nation at that time. These women were not simply filling a gap, they were reshaping America. Their work built not only weapons but a new sense of possibility, laying the foundation for a future where women would never again be told they could not work, could not lead, could not stand shoulder to shoulder with men. Photos like this remind us that history is not only about those who held power, but also about those who rolled up their sleeves, went to work, and changed the world without fanfare. Then there are the photos that capture America's contradictions, its struggles with itself. One haunting image from 1956 shows a group of black students walking into a newly integrated high school in the South. Their faces are calm, their backs straight, their clothes neatly pressed. Behind them, a crowd jeers, their mouths twisted in anger, their fists clenched. The photograph freezes that moment of courage, the bravery it took for children to walk through hatred with heads held high. When we look at that photo, we are reminded that progress was not given. It was fought for. That image unseen by many for decades, tells us more than any speech or law could. It shows us the cost of change, the courage of youth, the ugliness of prejudice, and the strength required to endure it. But not all unseen photographs are filled with hardship. Some capture fleeting moments of beauty that tell us who we are at our core. One such photograph, taken in 1925, shows a county fair. Children race with laughter, women fan themselves beneath wide-brimmed hats, and men lean on fences as horses thunder past. There is a Ferris wheel in the background, and in the foreground, a family sits on a blanket, sharing fried chicken from a tin bucket. It is a simple, joyful scene. That image reminds us that even in times of struggle, people sought joy. They gathered, they celebrated, they carved out moments of happiness. History is not just sorrow and hardship. It is also laughter at fairs, music at dances, and children running wild on summer evenings. These moments may not make the headlines, but they make up the soul of a people. And so, when we hold these unseen photographs, we are holding America's soul. We are seeing the country not through the eyes of politicians or generals, but through the eyes of ordinary men, women, and children who lived, loved, worked, and dreamed. Every crease, every shadow, every detail in those photographs tells us something about ourselves. They remind us that we are connected, that the struggles of the past shaped the freedoms of today, that the joys and sorrows of those who came before still echo in our lives. The past is not gone. It lives in these images, waiting for us to notice, to listen, to remember. There are moments when an unseen photograph can strike you so deeply that it feels as if time itself has stopped, and all you can do is stare. You forget the world around you. You forget your own worries. Instead, you are pulled into another era, into the heartbeat of a life that was lived long ago. These images, faded by years, remind us of something that words alone cannot hold. The texture of memory, the fragile weight of time. One such photograph shows a group of Civil War veterans gathered in a reunion in the early 1900s. They sit together in a shaded park, their uniforms faded and frayed, some draped over shoulders rather than worn. Their beards are long and white, their bodies hunched with age. Yet their eyes are bright, almost boyish, as they share stories, laugh together, and clasp each other's hands. You can almost hear the echoes of fifes and drums in the distance, though decades have passed since they marched into battle. But there is something deeper in that image. For all their smiles, there is also silence. Some faces are pained, staring, not at their comrades, but at the ground, lost in memories of war. Behind every laugh is the shadow of loss. The friends who never returned, the brothers buried in distant fields. That photograph holds both pride and sorrow in a single frame. It tells us that history does not end when the war is over. It lingers in the bones of those who lived it, in the empty spaces left at family tables, in the scars carried until death. Another photograph, taken in 1912, shows a coal miner emerging from the darkness of a mine in Pennsylvania. His face is blackened with soot, his eyes bright against the grime, his posture stooped from hours underground. He carries a lunch pail in one hand and a pickaxe in the other. Behind him, shadows of other miners stretch long against the light of day. The photo is haunting because it captures a life of unrelenting hardship. These men worked in silence beneath the earth, breathing dust that would one day fill their lungs with sickness. They risked collapse, fire, explosion. They lived with danger as a daily companion. And yet, when you look closely at the miner's face, you see not despair but resilience. You see a man who worked not for glory but for survival, for his family, for the hope of bread on the table and shoes for his children. His story is not written in books. He is not remembered in statues. But through that photograph, his life speaks louder than any monument. Photographs like these remind us that America was built not only by leaders and soldiers, but by countless unnamed men and women who endured, who bent their backs to labor, who sacrificed quietly and without praise. Another image, softer yet equally powerful, comes from 1923. It shows a one-room schoolhouse on the plains. Inside, rows of wooden desks are filled with children, their clothes patched, their shoes worn thin. The teacher, a young woman barely older than her students, stands at the front with chalk in her hand. Sunlight streams through tall windows. Dust motes dancing in the air. This photograph tells us about the hunger for knowledge that shaped so much of America's growth. These children came from farms and homesteads, walking miles across fields to sit in that room, to learn to read and write. Their families believed in education not as luxury, but as necessity. For them, knowledge was hope. The teacher, though, underpaid and often overlooked, carried the weight of shaping a generation, one lesson at a time. The photograph captures not just a classroom, but the very heartbeat of a young nation striving to learn, to improve, to reach higher. And then there is a photograph from 1940 that shows a breadline in Chicago. Dozens of men stand in line, their coats thin, their faces hollow with hunger. They stare straight ahead, some with eyes empty, others with quiet shame. At the front of the line, a small boy clutches his father's hand, his face half hidden behind a scarf. The child is out of place in the crowd of men, and that is what makes the image so powerful. You see not only the desperation of the Great Depression, but its inheritance passed down to the next generation. The photograph makes you wonder, what became of that boy? Did he grow into a man who carried the memory of hunger with him all his life? Did he build something better, fueled by the determination to never let his own children stand in such a line? This is the gift of unseen photographs. They stir our imaginations, compel us to see the human being behind the history, to ask questions that may never be answered but that connect us more deeply to the past. Another image from that same decade shows something different, a reminder that even in hardship, joy survived. It is a photograph of a dance hall in rural Kentucky. Couples twirl across a wooden floor, a fiddle player perched on a stool in the corner, his bow flying. The women's dresses are simple, the men's shirts rolled at the sleeves, yet their faces shine with happiness. The whole room seems alive, the blur of motion caught mid-spin, laughter frozen in time. That photograph reminds us that people did not give up joy, even in the darkest years. They still danced, they still sang, they still carved out spaces of light. And in those moments, they carried themselves through hardship. They built resilience not only through work, but through celebration. This, too, is history, the refusal to surrender joy. Then there are the photographs that capture transition, the moments when the world seemed to shift beneath people's feet. One such photo, taken in 1901, shows the crowded streets of New York. Horse-drawn carriages clog the road, but weaving between them is something new, a single automobile, small and strange against the sea of horses. On the sidewalks, people stop to stare. Some laugh, others point. That photo marks the beginning of a transformation, the dawn of the machine age. Looking at it now, we know what came next. Highways, suburbs, a nation built around the automobile. But at that moment, it was just a curiosity, something odd enough to draw stares. The photograph captures the precise instant when the old world and the new collided. Another photograph, equally powerful, comes from 1955. It shows a small living room with a family gathered around a glowing television set. The father sits in an armchair, his tie loosened after work. The mother sits on the sofa, knitting as she watches. The children are sprawled on the floor, eyes wide at the flickering screen. Behind them, a lamp glows, casting warm light over the room. This photograph is simple, domestic, ordinary. But it tells us about the birth of a new era, the way television reshaped American life, pulling families together in the evenings, shaping culture, spreading images and stories into every home. It is the beginning of something we now take for granted, but at that moment, it was magic. Unseen photographs like this show us not only the great struggles, but the quiet revolutions. They remind us that history is not just about wars and politics, but about how ordinary families lived, how they spent their evenings, what brought them comfort and connection. And then there are the photographs that hold pain too heavy for words. One, from 1937, shows a flood in Kentucky. Families stand on rooftops, clutching children, as the water rises around them. A boat pulls up to rescue them, the men inside straining against the current. In the faces of those waiting, you see fear, but also trust. They do not know what comes next, but they cling to each other. The photograph captures disaster in a way no headline can. You can feel the cold, see the desperation, almost hear the rushing of water. But you also see courage, the unspoken bond of neighbors, the determination to endure. These are the moments that remind us of the fragility of life and the strength of community. Every photograph, seen or unseen, carries within it an entire story. Sometimes it is obvious, written in the faces of those captured. Other times it is hidden in the corners, in the shadow of a veteran sitting alone at a parade, in the glance of a child holding a book, in the hand of a woman resting on her husband's arm. These details speak louder than any grand speech, because they are real. They are human. They remind us that history is not something distant. It is alive. It breathes through these images. And so, as we uncover these photographs, we are not just looking back. We are also looking within ourselves. We see the courage, the struggle, the joy, the pain, and we recognize it. Because though the faces may belong to another time, the emotions belong to us all. When we hold an old photograph in our hands, we are not just looking at an image. We are looking at a piece of time itself, something that once was alive and vibrant, now frozen in stillness. These unseen photographs are like forgotten voices, calling to us from across the years, urging us not to forget, not to let their lives vanish into silence. One of the most haunting photographs from America's past was taken in 1911 at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York. The image is stark. Fire trucks line the street, their ladders stretched high, but not high enough to reach the top floors. On the ground, a crowd gathers, faces lifted in horror. Shadows blur where bodies have fallen, young women who leapt rather than burn. It is not a staged photo. It is raw, brutal truth. And it tells us about the cost of greed, the way safety was ignored in the rush for profit. 146 people, most of them young immigrant women, lost their lives that day. The photograph, unseen by many, forces us to look into the cruelty of a system that saw workers as disposable. But it also reminds us of what followed. The anger, the protests, the demands for change that shaped the labor laws we live with today. That image holds both tragedy and transformation. Another photograph, quieter but equally powerful, comes from 1943. It shows a Japanese-American family standing beside their car, suitcases stacked at their feet, as soldiers look on. They are being forced into internment camps, stripped of their homes and dignity simply because of their ancestry. The father stands tall, his face stoic, but his eyes betray sorrow. The mother clutches the hand of her young son, who stares at the ground, confused and afraid. Behind them, their home looms silent, a place they will not return to for years. This photograph is a wound in our history. It tells us of injustice carried out in the name of security, of citizens who were treated as enemies by the country they loved. Yet it also tells us of endurance, of families who held together in the face of betrayal, who rebuilt their lives with quiet strength once the war was over. Looking at that photo now, we are reminded of how fragile freedom can be and how important it is never to let fear strip away our humanity. There are also photographs that capture hope so pure it feels almost like sunlight. One from 1945 shows Times Square on the day the war ended. Crowds fill the streets, strangers hugging strangers, confetti falling like snow. In the center of the photo, a sailor kisses a young woman, their embrace iconic of victory and relief. Around them, laughter, tears, joy spill over. That photograph, though famous, has unseen cousins. Images from small towns, from rural squares where farmers rang church bells, where neighbors gathered in the streets to celebrate peace. These photos remind us that history is not just about battles fought, but about wars finally ended, about the collective exhale of a nation weary of loss. And then there are the photographs that feel almost too intimate, too private, yet they survive as testaments to life. One such image, taken in 1905, shows a grandmother holding a newborn on her lap. Her hands are wrinkled, her face lined with years of work, but her eyes shine with tenderness as she gazes down at the child. The baby is swaddled in a simple cloth, its tiny fists clenched. Behind them, a window casts soft light across the room. That photograph holds an entire circle of life in one frame. The wisdom of age, the innocence of youth, the bridge between past and future. It is a reminder that history is not only about events and struggles, but also about moments of love, the passing of generations, the quiet continuity of family. It is these small, unseen moments that shaped America as much as wars or inventions. Another striking photograph comes from 1939 during the New York World's Fair. It shows a crowd gathered around the World of Tomorrow exhibit, their faces lit with awe as they gaze at models of futuristic cities, towering skyscrapers, and highways filled with cars. Children tug at their parents' sleeves, eyes wide with wonder. In their expressions, you can feel the optimism of a nation dreaming of progress, even as the clouds of war gathered overseas. The photograph is powerful because it captures a nation standing on the edge of change, believing in the promise of a brighter tomorrow. But perhaps the most moving unseen photographs are those that remind us of the ordinary beauty of life. 1. Image from the 1920s shows a family gathered on a front porch in the evening. The father strums a guitar, the mother hums softly, and the children sit cross-legged, listening, their eyes shining in the glow of a lantern. It is a simple scene, but it radiates warmth. No one in that photo imagined they were part of history. Yet, when we look at it today, we see the essence of what made America strong. Not just battles won or factories built, but families who found joy together in the simplest of ways. Another photograph, cracked and faded, shows a small-town Main Street in 1919. Men tip their hats as women in long skirts walk past. Children chase each other across the dusty road. A dog lounges in front of a hardware store. The details are ordinary, but that is what makes it powerful. It is a window into a world now gone, a reminder that history is not always about the extraordinary, but about the everyday moments that, added together, create the fabric of a nation. And then there are the photographs that strike us with their honesty. One from 1932 shows a mother in California, her face lined with exhaustion, her children leaning against her shoulders. She stares into the distance, her expression caught between fear and determination. This photograph, known later as Migrant Mother, became famous, but there are many others like it, unseen by most, scattered in archives and forgotten albums. They all tell the same story, that survival is not heroic in the grand sense, but in the daily choice to keep going, to keep caring, to keep loving even when the world feels impossible. When we look at these photographs, we are not just learning about history, we are learning about ourselves. We see the same emotions we carry today: fear, hope, love, pride, etched into the faces of those who came before. We see that though times have changed, the human heart has not. And that is why these unseen images matter so deeply. They bridge the gap between past and present. They remind us that history is not something locked away in books, but something alive within us. One final photograph lingers in my mind. It was taken in 1865 at the end of the Civil War. It shows a group of freedmen standing together outside a small cabin. Their clothes are tattered, their shoes worn thin, but their faces shine with something indescribable: freedom. Some smile, others look solemn, but all of them radiate a sense of standing at the edge of a new world. Behind them, children play in the dirt, their laughter caught mid-motion. The photograph is grainy, imperfect, but it carries a power that words cannot touch. It is the face of liberation, the moment when centuries of bondage gave way to the fragile promise of freedom. When we see that image today, we are humbled. We are reminded of how far we have come and how far we still must go. The photograph does not just tell us what happened. It calls us to remember, to honor, to continue the work of building a nation worthy of such sacrifices. And so, as we close this journey through unseen historical photographs, we must ask ourselves, what do these images mean for us now? They mean that history is not dead. It is not distant. It is here, in every faded print, in every face staring back at us. They mean that the struggles, the joys, the triumphs, and the losses of the past are not separate from us. They live within us. Each photograph is a thread woven into the great tapestry of America. And when we take the time to look, to truly see, we realize that we are part of that tapestry too. We carry forward the courage of the miner, the resilience of the farmer, the hope of the student, the love of the family on the porch. We are not separate from them. We are their continuation. The past, captured in these unseen images, changes how we see the present. It humbles us. It inspires us. It warns us. And it calls us to remember that the story of America is not finished. It is still being written, one moment, one photograph, one life at a time. And so, the next time you hold an old photo, do not just glance and move on. Look closely, listen, because within that still frame lies a voice, a heartbeat, a story waiting to be heard.